Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith, and today we are talking about you and the planet and how what you eat, what you buy, where you get your food from, the cosmetics you use, all that affects the planet. And you might say, wait, I thought this was a business podcast, and it is. And part of doing business ethically is looking at what is the long-term impact on what you're doing to the planet, to your kids, and what kind of planet you're leaving them. So we're talking today with a guy who's thought a lot about this, Jason Snyder of the Doomer Optimism podcast. We're talking about your relationship to your food. We're talking about homesteading, sustainability issues, local food. And by the end of this episode, you're going to have a couple more questions to ask yourself in regards to where you get your food, how your food is grown, and also how that food might be changing the energy in your life and the life of your family, which of course impacts the success of your business. Jason Snyder, welcome to Redbeard Radio.
It's an honor to be here, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me.
I am so happy to have you here because practitioners in the art of growing food are some of the most fun folks to talk to because there's a lot of misinformation out there about, oh, well, if the grid goes down, I'll just buy some seeds. And the reality is, no, then you'll starve. That it's actually really hard to grow food. And that first time you grow food, you think, oh, I'm growing enough carrots. And then after 4 meals, you realize you've eaten all the carrots you grew. You realize, wait a minute, I needed to grow 10 times as many carrots as this just to meet my carrots needs. And then you change your relationship. The first time you do that, you change your relationship to your food and you realize, wow, this is really hard. Even though we're the greatest food abundance of all time in terms of calories, growing food is hard. And some of the ways we're growing food right now aren't functioning very well for the planet, for the people doing the growing. And I'd love to hear from you, Jason. You say that you're really getting into homesteading. I'd love to hear about when you started to say, I need to go change the course of where I'm focusing, how I'm getting my food. What was the big driver for you in deciding to grow more of your own food?
For me, it started with more of a intellectual critique of our current food system. So my academic background was in food systems in various ways. And I was kind of trained in the mainstream model of, we need to boost productivity. I looked a lot in other countries, say in East Africa, and trying to help policymakers address issues over there. I also looked at food systems in the United States, like food deserts. But I started at a certain point, I just started taking our climate crisis and our ecological crisis seriously. And I started centering that as well as our energy future and prospects for an energy future, which I also find to be very uncertain. And, I think that perhaps we may be facing, more energy constraints as well as material throughput constraints in the future. And putting that front and center and thinking, okay, well, what does that imply for everything we think about our life? And food was just kind of a natural area of my focus. What would that imply about food systems? If we couldn't degrade the topsoil, if we couldn't just keep applying chemicals to fields and expect the same productivity growth, and we couldn't ignore the externalities and waterways being polluted and ocean acidification and ocean dead zones, if we couldn't ignore biodiversity loss, the bees dying, and if we couldn't ignore kind of culture and how much of our culture has really kind of been degraded in the sense of just not having kind of functional interdependence with our neighbors anymore, and kind of all of the cultural elements of society that arise out of that, right? So I read authors like Wendell Berry, who I think is probably speaks about the cultural side the most eloquently, and it just caused me to rethink what food systems, sustainable food systems would look like, both in terms of our planet, but also in terms of just rediscovering meaning in our lives and the central role that food and food culture plays in how we create meaning with each other.
I went to school at Washington State University on the east side of Washington State. Very different climate than when you think of Washington, you think of Seattle and trees and rain. The east side is much drier, more of a desert. But there's this place called the Palouse, which is where my school was. and it's all wheat now.
Hmm.
But when the white man first came there, it was hugely productive. The amount of topsoil was, and I can't find the exact data, but it was many,
Hmm.
many feet thick.
Yeah.
And then we dammed up the rivers, and then we were able to go farm everything that it used to be just buffalo land. Really, you can't grow anything there until we dammed everything. And then we proceeded to monocrop it and poison it for
Hmm.
decades and decades. And it's still immensely productive, but they are measuring how much topsoil we're losing every year. And it's huge.
Yeah.
And it appears to be our plan is to monocrop it. And for folks who don't know, monocrop is where you grow only one thing on a big piece of land, as opposed to you think of a home scale garden where you're growing some carrots here, some beets there. Monocropping is far more productive in many ways, where you can have these huge combines and everything you're growing is the same. So you can use the same pesticides everywhere, hugely productive. And it's why the US has such a food abundance. And also, it does interesting things like removes many feet of topsoil over the course of a couple generations. And here's the problem: that topsoil took thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to deposit.
Hmm.
And we're removing it in like 100 years, the fertility of the soil. And we don't appear to have a plan besides keep on doing what we're doing harder and faster.
Hmm.
So, and then people like you, Jason, you realize, okay, well, this is not going to work.
Hmm.
But what's next? And there's what's next on the individual level, but there's what's next
Hmm.
on the societal level.
Yeah.
That this is not a problem where we can say, well, I'm going to start, I don't know, raising chickens, which I've done a couple times.
Hmm.
I'm going to start raising chickens. Therefore, I'm not part of the problem, so I can ignore it.
Hmm.
It doesn't work because the topsoil and the pollutants matters to all of us because that's where the wheat's grown. It's
Right.
not the only place in the country, but it's
Right.
huge. Or what kind of pesticides we're using on the apples. If you eat an apple in the store, it probably comes from Washington State.
Hmm.
And we use incredible amounts of pesticides on our apple crop. Well, yeah, so you can't just put an apple tree in your backyard and say, I'm no longer part of the apple ecosystem.
Hmm.
Your neighbors are still being poisoned with incredible amounts of pesticides.
Yeah.
So we need a societal solution, but we also need the individual actions we can take to change our relationship with the planet with how we eat. So would you please solve everything in the next 5 minutes?
Yeah. Well, there's multiple theories of change, and oftentimes they seem conflicting. I actually don't think they're conflicting. And so I would say there's two main theories of change, and one is kind of bottom up and one is top down. So the bottom up theory of change is, you start where you are, you support your kind of local food economy and, sustainable food economy. And that will kind of spread out, broad scale over time. And then there's, of course, the perspective that, well, we're all swimming upstream because the policy environment only allows so much of that, right? If
Mhm.
so many millions, billions of dollars in subsidies are going to these highly productive, for sure, but also destructive in the long term practices, then there's just so much we can do given the economic environment and other things. And I, probably not surprising, I tend to think it's ultimately going to have to be both.
Mhm.
There's also people focused on more kind of small scale agroecology, creating kind of alternative economies, and there's people focused on how can I convince large scale farmers to slowly but surely adopt more regenerative practices. And so there's a great podcast I recommend everyone, the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. And he was a former conventional farmer. His family had been farming for, I think, generations. And he decided to make a switch. And now his kind of, goal in life, Jack Kemp, is to basically convince other conventional farmers that, hey, you can transition and the first year or two you might take a bit of a hit, but in the long term it's actually profitable for you to do this. One, that you'll cut out a lot of your inputs, and you're going to be able to maintain a certain level of productivity. But two, there's all kinds of ecosystem benefits. That, by the way, there's also new markets coming online for like regenerative finance that are starting to figure out how to value these ecosystem benefits. Creating, say, biocorridors for animals, improving water supply in the region instead of degrading it, that you will actually maybe get paid for as well. And so there's kind of actually, so maybe I've described three, three different theories of change. Is large scale kind of how can you slowly but surely, like, the conventional farmer makes one small change in the season, right? Like maybe they'll plant a cover crop that season, and that's it, right? And then maybe the next year they'll cut down their, pesticide application by a little bit and encourage, predator species that will go after those pests, right? And so it's not so much of a risk, but it's kind of a slow but sure transition. And then, of course, there's just government policy, right? Just getting our policy in line. I personally, I think policy could make a big difference, but that's, as many political issues in this country, our politics is dysfunctional. It's not really working for the common people. It's really largely based on, you know, incentives of money. And so I'm personally, that's not where I put my focus, because I think that for most people, where they can have the most impact is supporting their local food economies. And perhaps that could provide a foundation or a scaffolding for, almost like what I would call like a figure ground reversal, where if it just becomes so kind of common and widespread that this alternative food economy is rising, at a certain point, it just might become the dominant economy and kind of, engulf the mainstream one.
You can win in small doses.
Yeah.
A buddy of ours told us about a local farm that she was buying a duck at. So we went to go to the farm to go buy a duck. And then this is a already slaughtered in the freezer duck. While we were there, they had some more chickens they hadn't sold. So we got those for cheaper than usual. So we got to have a locally grown duck that had a fantastic life, eating bugs, utterly delicious, of course. Way more expensive than you'd find at the local discount grocery store, but also a completely different animal, right? I didn't have to lobby Congress. I didn't have to wait for a politician to pass a bill. I just ate a good duck and got to make friends with these farmers and end up getting these additional chickens. So now, because it happened to be the end of the year run, they had extra stuff in their freezer. I got them on a discount. I didn't have to go wait. I can make some kind of change now. And I think that's a big part of this, is that some problems we look at and say, well, I can't solve, I cannot solve the pollute topsoil problem. It is impossible. I will never do it. I could dedicate my whole life. Some folks have dedicated their whole lives, complete failure, no progress. Whereas I have so much power over what is in my fridge right now. And who do I buy it from?
Yeah.
And that is just huge. We have another friend we're buying half a pig from. So that's huge. But I'd like to ask you, Jason, about the problem of cost, where when I look at this duck, I think it was $50 for this duck, which I don't know what a duck is in a store. $25. It was like twice as expensive. And these chickens we got, they were the super discounts. They were only $20 each, but their normal price is $38 for a chicken. Yeah. And it's a little bit smaller. It's like more like 5 pounds compared to the 6 pound chicken you can get at Winco for $10 or $6. So people say, well, I'm not rich. I can't afford to pay double, triple, quadruple on any kind of regular basis to buy locally sourced, regeneratively grown meat products. What do you say to that?
I'd say it's a valid critique, and it's probably maybe the most difficult bottleneck to this future that I envision. Now, from the political lens, you could say that you're not paying when you go buy a chicken at the mainstream supermarket. You're not paying the full cost of that chicken, right? You're not paying the environmental cost. You're not paying the cost of degrading kind of cultural bonds that used to cultures used to feed each other. There's a lot of costs that you're not paying, and you're also competing with the subsidies, right, that are disproportionately geared towards these large scale systems, and so you are paying it as well through your taxes. That doesn't help me now, of course, right, where I just feel like I can't afford to buy certain kinds of food. I guess I would say two things here. One is that's one reason why I encourage people to produce for themselves as much as possible in the short term, right? It might be more expensive to buy a chicken from the store that's organically grown and happy chicken and all of those things, but to raise it yourself and to feed it, over the long run, you actually save quite a bit of money. The cost of feed is less than than you would pay if you if you bought it at the store. Now, of course, that requires a labor cost.
Mm.
And I think that's something that we're going to have to accept as a real trade-off, is that small scale regenerative agriculture, it overall requires more labor. There's plenty of evidence that it can be equally productive and actually more productive in terms of nutrient per acre. And also there's all these benefits of like local resiliency, right? Of even in areas like, say, in Iowa, where, highly productive, agricultural communities, most farmers have to get most of their food from the supermarket because they specialize so much in one crop.
Right.
So there's this regional specialization that makes us dependent on supply chains. So there's that. But, I think it's going to be, again, we have to accept at the end of the day that there's going to have to be many more farmers in the future, that we're going to have to value the farming profession again. And we're actually going to have to rethink much of our society to be oriented around these farm economies. And if we can accept that, that it's more labor intensive, I think that might be the biggest pill to swallow, that there's just no getting around it.
There's a benefit of the increased labor, which it sounds like it's just extra work. But one of the problems, which I experience because I work in an office, so I spend a lot of time talking and typing, right? My body was not designed to talk and type all day. I have a standing desk.
Yeah.
That's great. But I'm still indoors talking or typing. We're recording this in January 2022, and I have a 1,500 square foot garden to go broad fork and weed and get ready. And that is a counterbalance. You could go pay a lot of money to some fitness club to go get the kind of workout you get with a broad fork, which if folks don't know what that is, it's sort of like a giant pitchfork that you go and you manhandle and wrestle around to go break up soil and get it ready for planting. I have some fence I got to go put in. And you think, okay, well, why is a guy with a business, unless you're, totally broke, why are you doing this yourself? Well, it's because it makes your body better. It balances your mind. And I can show up better to my work with my clients, show up better with my podcast guests, because I have this balance in my life. And it's something that we've spent so long trying to get out of balance to where we can get everything from the grocery store. And now we have this choice. And if it's growing some kale on your balcony, that's fine. We have this choice to go get a bit more in balance and understand things better and move our bodies more. So it's not all cost.
Yeah. I like Chris Mage reframes it as, instead of labor intensive, it's job rich. And I really like that. I think you're right. Our economy has increasingly become more and more specialized, and we've become less able to do things, right? Especially physically with our hands, because we've outsourced it to other people. And that might work in this economy, but our economy is not guaranteed to provide that affordance in the future. And you're right. My major source of kind of like mental health upkeep, I like meditation, but probably even more powerful than that is physical labor. I love physical labor, not too much, of course. I don't want to be laboring 12 hours a day, but a few hours every day really just does wonders for my mind, for my spirit. And it connects me, like you said, to the food itself, right? It brings meaning back into my consumption. It's, making me somewhat of a producer again. And I think part of the solution here is not just that we need more farmers, but we need more producers, right? More people at whatever scope they can produce for themselves, not just growing food, but learning how to fix things, right? Learning how to use their hands, how to build things, right? And if you're getting into like livestock production and you're having to put up fencing or build a chicken coop, I just think that's good for our soul, and it also helps build more resilient communities, right? Because we're not always dependent on a larger system that might not have our best interests at heart.
And it adds to our energy. That's one of the things that we don't talk about as much as we should as entrepreneurs, about where's our food coming from. And when I eat a carrot that my wife grew, that carrot, and back when I was growing carrots myself, just for myself, it tastes something like 10 times more carrot-like than the carrot that you get at a store. Even if that carrot was freshly delivered from a farm, that you pull the carrot out of the ground, you wipe off the dirt, you bite into it, or you cut it up, the smell of a carrot fills the whole house. It is alive in a way. And there is a strong connection between how alive your food is and how well you perform as a human being.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of nutrition, right? We've seen that kind of the nutrient density of many of our foods, many of our vegetables have gone down in the last few decades. And so you can say, okay, maybe it's twice double the price for an organic carrot or a regeneratively grown carrot, but you're probably getting more than twice as much nutrition per calorie. So I think that's something
Yeah.
that people don't often consider. I will say
Yeah.
though, just kind of, say you're living in an apartment, you don't have any space to grow things. Maybe you could do a few potted plants, a few potted tomatoes, and absolutely, like, you have to start somewhere. But if money is a real concern, there are, in many places, there are programs to, for example, double up food bucks, where, if you go to the farmer's market and buy food, you basically get like half off is what it amounts to. And so
Mm.
I'm in support of these kinds of programs. I think, while we're making the transition in an economic system that doesn't value these things like they should, we should support especially lower income people to have that option. And so I just want to throw that out there as well.
Everyone makes better decisions when they're eating real food.
Yeah,
And if you're in doubt of this, go eat McDonald's until you vomit and then try to make an important business decision. And you
absolutely.
will find that your body will be slower. If you drink a gallon of Coke, or really even 1 cup, you'll find that your body is slower, your brain is slower, you're not as sharp. And we dose ourselves every day with all kinds of what I call NFOs, near food objects, that, like,
Yeah.
an Oreo is an NFO. Like, it sort of looks maybe like food, and it's sort of like you can eat it.
Hmm.
But what an Oreo does to your brain, and maybe also your heart, is intense.
Yeah.
It's a big problem. I want to talk here real quick about a friend of mine, a client of mine, who does the regenerative agriculture thing.
Hmm.
His name is Charles Mayfield. And besides selling his meat, he also has a skincare line called Farrow, Farrow. And the website is farrow.life, where he does cosmetics that are based on, that they come from pigs that are grown in a regenerative fashion. So it's not just food we're talking about here. As you think about how can you de-industrial foodalize your life, or de-industrial ag your life,
Hmm.
looking at your cosmetics as well. Farrow.life might have some stuff that would be really good for you or for your sweetheart. And I know the farmer. So that's one thing, is if you know your farmer's name, that's really good. I
Yeah.
also want to share one other thought before we go here, which is, it may sound like, oh man, growing your own chickens, way too much work, or finding an individual farmer for all your own chickens, way too much work. There is a middle path that I find works pretty good for us, which is we are on a first name basis with our local butcher.
Hmm.
So he himself inspects every animal that comes off the truck. He's just crazy about meat. He'll talk your ear off about meat. It is beautiful. This man is obsessed with his craft, and it shows. And because it's a larger organization than just being a farmer, I can buy most of our meat there. And I know that it's locally grown, grass fed beef. And also, because he's a bigger shop, he occasionally has sales when he has big gluts. So I buy grass fed ground beef by the 40 or 50 pound box. And I've gotten for as low as like $3.19 a pound, which is just insane.
Yeah.
Way cheaper. It's cheaper than a McDonald's hamburger, which has a quarter pound of, quote, ground beef, unquote. So sometimes it's finding a butcher, as opposed to buying your meat at the grocery store.
Yeah.
Sometimes that alone can really get you affordable, locally grown meat at a much better deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly recommend, if you can, find direct sources, like direct sources from the farmers. There's what are called
Mm-hmm.
CSAs, community supported agriculture, that works for vegetables as well. That's more direct. But it's not, you're not just getting a direct source of meat or vegetables or other product. You're building relationships,
Yeah.
right? You're building relationships that will serve you and your community in many other ways, right? Building these patterns of functional interdependence that, I think is really what culture is based on, right? And so you're building culture, you're building society, and I would also say that politics ultimately is downstream from
Mm-hmm.
culture. And so if you start building up culture by creating these relationships, and both with people and the land, ultimately this could lead to political transformation as well.
I love the phrase cultural interdependence. Well, I know a few people at the local big grocery store. I don't have a
Mm.
relationship with Hagen's. I can't.
Yeah.
But I know the butcher, and I know a lot of the staff at the butcher because it's a small shop and they know me. I walk in the door, they start preparing the big cardboard boxes because they know that it's me.
Yeah.
So we have this relationship, and where we get our duck from, where we're getting our pig from, and those relationships just change your experience of eating food away from more of a it's cliche, but more of a consumer experience, like you're going to McDonald's, and into more of a you're in connection with the world.
Yeah.
And I think for entrepreneurs, a lot of the folks listening here are small business owners. This is what we all want. We want our customers to have a personal relationship with us. We want to have a personal relationship with our customers. We want that small scale connection. That's part of why people should do business with us versus some huge firm that promises to do something similar. So I can think of no better way to do that than to exhibit, to be the kind of customer you want for yourself, to be that for your local farmers, to be that for your local butcher, for your local CSA, and to be that connected, like you're saying, cultural. You say cultural independence, Jason. What a beautiful phrase.
And if things, if shit hits the fan in the future and supply chains break down, they're going to remember that you supported them when times were good. I'll add that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Folks, to hear more of how Jason thinks the podcast is Doomer Optimism, you can go ahead and get that at anchor.fm/Doomer, DOOMER-optimism, and then over on Twitter at Cognazor, or if I'm saying that right, COGNAZOR.
Cognazor,
Jason, thank you for being on the show. Any final thoughts?
I think you summarized it pretty well. This is a business-oriented podcast, and I think the way that you framed it is really good, right? Like, I think as a business, you want to connect with your customers in a real way, and do it while also supporting the larger functioning of culture and society. And you can only do that at a certain scale, and finding the right scale where you can maintain those relationships and be transparent, I think, is the way to go. It will be the business model of the future. I think it has to be.
Beautifully said. That's the Doomer Optimism podcast, folks. Jason Snyder on Twitter at Cognazor, COGNAZOR. Jason, thank you for being on Redbeard Radio.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.